The death of Pedrinho Matador. The end of the man who said he wasn't afraid to die. Have you ever imagined spending more than 40 years in prison, confessing to more than 100 deaths, publicly saying you feel no remorse, and even so ending your own life sitting in a plastic chair on an ordinary Sunday morning? This is not just another crime story. On March 5th, 2023, the man known as Pedrinho Matador met the same fate that marked the lives of so many others. But what really happened that Sunday, and more importantly, was his destiny already written in childhood? Today, you're going to understand not only how he died, but why this story begins much earlier, long before the fame, long before prison, long before the first victim. Pedro Rodrigues Filho, better known as Pedrinho Matador, was born on July 17, 1954, in Santa Rita do Sapucaí, Minas Gerais. He would become the criminal who spent the longest time behind bars in Brazil. Officially, 71 victims were recognized, although he himself claimed there were far more. And most striking of all, a large part of those deaths happened inside prison. But to understand the end, we need to go back to the beginning. The violence, according to his own accounts, began even before his birth. He was born with a skull injury, which he said was the result of assaults his father committed against his mother during pregnancy. The violence didn't start with him. He grew up hearing stories about taking justice into your own hands. One of the most striking involved his grandmother, who allegedly killed a man who tried to assault her while she was working in the fields. The message that stayed in his mind was simple: if a person is bad, eliminating them isn't wrong. The problem is that, over time, the concept of what was bad became more and more distorted. The first crime happened when he was only 13 years old. A trivial argument with a cousin escalated into violence. A punch. Wounded pride. And there, on a farm, working with a sugarcane grinder, the situation spiraled out of control in a way that could never be undone. After that, he used a machete. He was taken to the police station, but he went home the same day. No detention, no juvenile measures, nothing. Can you imagine what goes through the mind of a teenager who takes a life and then returns home as if nothing happened? For him, that confirmed one thing. He believed he was right, and that belief would shape everything. At 14, he killed the city's deputy mayor, claiming the man had unfairly fired his father. Soon after, he killed the person actually responsible for a theft that had been blamed on his father. He didn't see himself as a murderer. He saw himself as an avenger. And disturbingly, many people around him began to see him that way too, reinforcing his sense of purpose, especially when he started killing individuals accused of sexual crimes inside prison. Behind bars, he gained respect, fear, and an almost mythical reputation. For many inmates, he became someone who enforced a brutal form of order. But that reputation only deepened the cycle of violence that defined his identity, and made it harder for any possibility of change to exist. One of the darkest chapters involved his own father. Pedrinho's father was arrested for killing his wife, Pedrinho's mother. Inside prison, father and son faced each other. Pedrinho decided to take revenge, saying he needed to deliver the same number of blows his father had given her. It was as if he followed a personal code, a distorted mathematics of justice that only he understood. After that, his notoriety grew even more within the prison system. He became known as the man who eliminated inmates considered undesirable. Adding up all his convictions, his sentences exceeded 100 years. But Brazilian law at the time limited the maximum time served to 30 years, which meant that despite the scale of his crimes, he would not remain imprisoned for life. He was released in 2007, returned to prison shortly after, and was released again years later. During that period, he gave interviews, appeared on television, and even created a YouTube channel. He claimed he had converted, said he had changed, and tried to present himself as someone who wanted to warn young people about the dangers of crime. But one sentence always stood out in those interviews: "If someone comes against me, I defend myself." When asked whether he feared revenge, his answer was always direct. He said he wasn't afraid. He claimed he had already died many times inside prison. That sense of inevitability followed him like a shadow. Even during his years of supposed freedom, there is an irony that cannot be ignored. He said he once prayed to die when he was young, said he had lived through so much violence that death no longer frightened him. But what no one expected was that the end would come silently, on a Sunday morning, before a simple family lunch, without confrontation, without warning, and without any chance to react. On March 5, 2023, Pedrinho was in Mogi das Cruzes, in Greater São Paulo, visiting a niece's house in the Ponte Grande neighborhood. The plan was ordinary. Spend time with relatives, share a meal, enjoy what seemed to be a quiet day. There were no visible signs of tension, no indication that anything unusual was about to happen that morning. Around 8:30 a.m., a relative noticed a black car slowly driving down the street. It didn't stop. It didn't make noise. It simply passed, as if observing the environment. That subtle movement might have seemed meaningless at the time, just another vehicle in a quiet neighborhood. But later it would become one of the most chilling details of that morning. At approximately 9:50 a.m., Pedrinho was sitting in a chair in front of the house. The sky was clear, the light was typical of a calm Sunday, and nothing suggested danger. Then the same car returned. This time, it didn't just pass by. It stopped. The stillness of that moment lasted only seconds, but it marked the point of no return. Two men stepped out. One of them wore a mask. Their message was direct and cold. "This has nothing to do with you. Grab your daughter and go inside." They were not there to rob anyone, not there to threaten the family, not there by mistake. The target was specific. It was him. Everything that followed happened extremely fast. Shots were fired. Pedrinho fell from the chair. One of the attackers approached him, ensuring the act was finished. There was no argument, no attempt to flee, no dramatic confrontation. The men returned to the vehicle and disappeared within moments, leaving behind a silence that contrasted with the violent history that had defined his entire life. Minutes later, military police were called, and the case was registered as aggravated homicide. Hours afterward, the car used in the attack was found abandoned on Estrada de Cruz do Século. Inside the vehicle, investigators found unused ammunition and a gasoline can, a detail that raised disturbing questions about whether they had planned to destroy evidence. The presence of the gasoline can led to speculation. Were they planning to burn the car? Did something interrupt their plan? Or was it simply a precaution in case they needed to erase traces quickly? To this day, no one has been officially held responsible for the crime, which adds another layer of uncertainty to an already complex story. The day before, Pedrinho had posted a video of himself playing pool at a bar, with the location tagged in Mogi das Cruzes. Nothing in the recording suggested fear, tension, or the sense that he was being watched. He was 68 years old and claimed he was living peacefully, trying to distance himself from the violent identity of his past. But that raises an inevitable question. Was it revenge? An old score finally being settled? Over decades, he had built an enormous list of possible enemies. He killed inside and outside prison, confronted criminal factions, and left behind families marked by loss. It is impossible to measure how many people may have silently waited for that moment. In interviews, he often repeated a phrase that became symbolic. "If they come against me, I defend myself." Yet, on that morning, there was no defense and no time to react. Perhaps the man who spent his life surviving violent confrontations never imagined that the end would arrive so suddenly, without warning, without struggle, and without control. There is something almost symbolic in the way his story closed. For years, he believed he was applying his own version of justice, deciding who deserved to live or die. But when the law is ignored, the definition of justice becomes personal and unstable. In the end, someone may have used that same logic against him. When the news spread, reactions were immediate and divided. Some people said it was only a matter of time. Others claimed he always knew this could happen. There were those who celebrated, those who reflected, and those who questioned what his life revealed about the justice system. Almost no one remained indifferent to the outcome of such a controversial figure. Pedrinho's story was never simple. It forces society to confront uncomfortable debates about justice, revenge, punishment, and the limits of the law. His life blurred those boundaries repeatedly, creating a narrative that some saw as vigilantism and others saw as brutality. That ambiguity helped sustain the fascination surrounding his name for decades. One question continued to follow him. Did he really change? After leaving prison, he claimed to have converted, to have embraced religion, and to want a different life. He said he advised young people not to follow the same path. Yet many of his statements still carried traces of confrontation, as if the past had never completely released him. Psychologists and criminologists who analyzed his trajectory often pointed to a combination of factors: a violent childhood, the absence of consistent limits, early exposure to crime without meaningful consequences, and later reinforcement inside the prison system. These elements can create a powerful cycle in which violence becomes normalized and eventually forms identity. When his first homicide at the age of 13 resulted in no lasting intervention, it may have sent an unconscious message that there were no real barriers. Without those barriers, impulses grow stronger. Over time, repetition reduces emotional impact, and actions that once would have caused shock become routine, both for the individual and for those around him. This process is often described as desensitization. The more violence is experienced or repeated, the less shocking it becomes. In Pedrinho's case, prison became a stage where his identity was reinforced. Inside that environment, he gained status, recognition, and fear, something he had never experienced in the outside world before incarceration. According to reports, inmates would react to his presence with a mixture of fear and admiration. That reaction strengthened the narrative he had built about himself, transforming him from an individual into a symbol within prison culture. Over time, that symbolic role made it even harder to separate the man from the myth surrounding his actions. When he was finally released after decades, Brazil had changed dramatically. The country he returned to was connected by the internet, shaped by social media, and fascinated by true crime stories. He began giving interviews, appearing on television, and sharing his version of events, trying to reinterpret his past through a new lens. He claimed he had found faith, that he now wanted to guide others away from crime, and that violence no longer defined him. Many listeners wanted to believe that transformation was possible. Yet the absence of explicit remorse and the persistence of confrontational language created doubt about whether the change was profound or simply a consequence of age. There is a significant difference between exhaustion and repentance. Aging can slow behavior, but it does not necessarily transform beliefs. Some observers argued that what appeared to be change might have been fatigue after decades of conflict, rather than a genuine reassessment of the suffering caused throughout his life. His own statements sometimes sounded almost prophetic. He said he had already died several times, that he was not afraid of death, and that if it came, it would simply be the end of a path he had long accepted. Those remarks, repeated over the years, created the impression of someone who believed his fate was inseparable from violence. For much of his life, Pedrinho believed he controlled the game. He chose who lived, who died, and how conflicts would end. Inside prison, that illusion of control was reinforced daily. Outside, however, control was never truly his. Time, circumstance, and other people's decisions would ultimately define the final chapter. In the end, he did not choose the day, the place, or the moment. The chair where he sat became the last setting of a story, marked by movement and confrontation. There was no elaborate plan, no dramatic farewell, and no final declaration. The silence that followed contrasted sharply with the noise of his past. After the news circulated, public debate intensified once more. Some people saw the outcome as inevitable, while others questioned what his trajectory revealed about society itself. Why do figures associated with extreme violence generate fascination as well as rejection? The answer may lie in how such stories force us to confront uncomfortable truths. There is something deeply unsettling about narratives like this. They provoke outrage, but they also capture attention. Documentaries, interviews, and reports about violent lives often attract enormous audiences. This reaction does not necessarily reflect admiration, but rather a complex psychological need to understand what appears incomprehensible. Part of this fascination is linked to the archetype of the avenger. For years, some individuals interpreted Pedrinho as someone who did what the system failed to do. That perception, however, is extremely dangerous, because when a person assumes the role of judge and executioner, the boundary between justice and revenge begins to disappear. When that boundary fades, the criteria for punishment become personal rather than legal. Anyone can be labeled guilty according to someone else's perspective. History shows that such logic rarely remains contained. It expands, distorts, and eventually harms even those who once believed they were acting in defense of order. Another factor is repetition. The more a story is told, the more its shocking elements lose intensity. What was once horrifying can slowly become familiar. Familiarity, in turn, can transform tragedy into something consumed as information or entertainment, reducing the emotional distance that should separate observer from event. Pedrinho himself contributed to building this narrative. He understood how to tell his story, when to display emotion, and when to appear indifferent. At times, he spoke as a perpetrator. At others, he emphasized the suffering of his childhood. That alternation created a complex image that divided audiences and fueled debate. When personal pain is intertwined with acts of violence, interpretation becomes more difficult. People begin to ask whether different circumstances might have produced another outcome. That question does not erase responsibility, but it highlights how social environments, early experiences, and institutional responses can influence the paths individuals follow. Specialists often highlight how trajectories like this are rarely the result of a single factor. They emerge from an accumulation of experiences, including early exposure to violence, the absence of consistent intervention, and later reinforcement by environments where aggression becomes a form of recognition. Over time, behavior and identity can merge. If meaningful intervention had occurred after his first crime, the path might have been different. That possibility cannot be proven, but it illustrates how prevention and accountability play essential roles in breaking cycles. Violence seldom appears suddenly. It is constructed gradually, shaped by responses that either interrupt or reinforce it. When Pedrinho was killed, there was no spectacle, no cinematic confrontation, and no symbolic closure. There was only an ordinary street, an ordinary morning, and the abrupt end of a life that had been anything but ordinary. The contrast between the scale of his past and the simplicity of his final moment is striking. In death, the myth dissolved, leaving only the reality of a man whose existence had been defined by conflict. Without the aura created by decades of notoriety, what remained was not legend, but consequence. That shift forces observers to reconsider how narratives are built and why society sometimes elevates individuals into symbols. Ultimately, the story raises questions rather than offering conclusions. How far does individual responsibility extend? And where does collective responsibility begin? Can someone truly transform after decades immersed in violence? Or does time merely soften the visible edges of behavior without altering its deeper structure? The fascination surrounding figures like Pedrinho reveals as much about society as it does about the individual himself. Stories of extreme behavior force people to confront fears, moral boundaries, and the fragile balance between justice and retaliation. They expose tensions that exist not only in institutions, but also in collective imagination. When violence becomes part of identity, reversing that process is extraordinarily difficult. Habits, beliefs, and social roles reinforce one another until they create a closed cycle. Breaking that cycle requires intervention, accountability, and support structures that were largely absent during the formative stages of his life. Many observers described his life as an example of how violence can reproduce itself across generations. He was born into aggression, internalized it as a response to conflict, and later projected it outward repeatedly. In the end, the same logic that had shaped his actions may have returned to confront him in his final moments. That repetition creates what some analysts call a cycle of validation. Each violent act appears to justify the next, especially when met with recognition, fear, or notoriety. Over time, the distinction between cause and consequence becomes blurred, making it difficult to identify where responsibility begins or ends. When news of his death spread, reactions reflected that complexity. Some expressed relief, others discomfort, and many uncertainty about how to interpret the conclusion of such a controversial life. The absence of a clear resolution left space for reflection rather than closure, emphasizing the unresolved questions he left behind. Beyond the individual story, the case highlights how societies struggle to deal with violence once it becomes deeply rooted. Punishment alone rarely addresses the origins of behavior, while prevention requires long-term commitment and resources. Without those elements, cycles tend to repeat themselves, often in slightly different forms. Pedrinho's trajectory illustrates how early normalization of aggression can shape perception. When violent responses are presented as acceptable or necessary, they can become internal rules. Over time, those rules operate independently of external laws, creating a personal moral code disconnected from broader social standards. Such personal codes are difficult to dismantle because they are reinforced by experience. Each act interpreted as justified strengthens belief in that logic. Without intervention capable of challenging those assumptions, individuals may continue to act within the same framework, even when circumstances appear to change. In later years, his attempts to reinterpret his past through religion and public statements suggested a search for meaning. Yet they also revealed how difficult it is to reconstruct identity after decades defined by violence. Transformation, when it occurs, is rarely immediate or complete, and often remains surrounded by skepticism. The end of his life did not resolve the contradictions that marked it. Instead, it underscored them. A man who once dominated environments through fear died in an ordinary setting, without spectacle, without resistance, and without the control he had long claimed to possess over his own destiny. This contrast between a life of extreme acts and an unremarkable ending is one of the most striking aspects of the story. It suggests how, in reality, narratives rarely conclude with the dramatic symmetry people expect. Instead, they end abruptly, shaped by circumstance rather than intention or symbolism. For observers, that ending becomes an invitation to reflect not only on what he did, but on how societies respond to individuals who follow similar paths. Are systems capable of intervening early enough? Do institutions recognize warning signs in time? These questions extend far beyond a single biography. The discussion also touches on accountability. Understanding the influences behind violent behavior does not eliminate responsibility, but it can clarify how patterns develop. Recognizing those patterns is essential if the goal is to prevent repetition rather than simply react after harm has already occurred. In this sense, the story is less about one man and more about the environment that surrounded him from the beginning. Violence, neglect, recognition through fear, and later public fascination all interacted to sustain a trajectory that might otherwise have been interrupted. Each element reinforced the others over time. By the time his life ended, the narrative had already become part of public memory, debated and reinterpreted by different generations. Some saw a warning, others a symbol of failure within institutions, and still others a case study in how personal and social dynamics can intertwine in destructive ways. As time passes, stories like this tend to shift from immediate news into broader reflection. They become references in discussions about criminal justice, rehabilitation, and prevention. The individual details remain important, but the larger significance lies in what they reveal about recurring social challenges. One recurring theme is how difficult it is to interrupt cycles once they are established. Early intervention requires coordination between families, institutions, and communities, something that is not always present. Without that structure, patterns can solidify long before they are fully recognized. Pedrinho's life demonstrates how recognition, even when rooted in fear, can reinforce behavior. Inside prison, notoriety functioned almost like validation, giving him a defined role and identity. That dynamic shows how environments can unintentionally sustain the very conduct they are meant to contain. Outside prison, media attention created another form of reinforcement. Interviews, documentaries, and public curiosity kept his image circulating, sometimes transforming complex realities into simplified narratives. This process illustrates how storytelling itself can influence the way violence is remembered and understood. In the end, separating the individual from the narrative built around him becomes difficult. The myth and the man intertwine, shaping perception long after events have passed. What remains is not only a record of actions, but also an ongoing debate about meaning, responsibility, and consequence. As narratives evolve, they often reveal more about collective perception than about isolated facts. The way people interpret a life marked by violence can vary widely, influenced by personal beliefs, cultural context, and trust in institutions. This diversity of interpretation explains why such cases continue to provoke debate long after they end. For some, the story stands as a warning about the consequences of unresolved aggression and neglect. For others, it highlights the limitations of punishment without rehabilitation. These contrasting readings show how a single trajectory can generate multiple lessons, none of them entirely sufficient on their own. Ultimately, the significance of the case lies not only in what happened, but in what it prompts society to examine about itself. Questions about prevention, responsibility, and the possibility of change remain open. They do not end with one life, because the conditions that shape such paths continue to exist elsewhere. The silence that followed his death may have closed a personal chapter, yet it did not end the broader conversation. Instead, it shifted attention toward understanding how similar cycles begin and how they might be interrupted before reaching the same conclusion in future generations. In that sense, the story resists a definitive ending. It remains an example studied, discussed, and reconsidered over time, not for spectacle, but for the difficult reflections it demands. What began as an individual history becomes part of a larger dialogue about violence, accountability, and the structures meant to contain both. If this story made you reflect, don't let it stop here. Subscribe to the channel now, because there are stories that need to be told, not to entertain, but to open our eyes. Every video here is a deeper dive into real cases that show what happens when society chooses to ignore the warning signs. And make sure to watch the next video already appearing on your screen, because understanding the past may be the only way to avoid repeating the same mistakes.